ways as a Zimbabwean lawyer. I know she's a Christian, and my parents are Christians. I haven't decided what I am yet. And that reminded me of the scripture in Luke 14:11 that says, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Beatrice has tried to humble herself. She's a humble person, I'm sure about that. But when she asked for that, I decided I was going to go max on her. And here is her CV or introduction, short bio. Beatrice has worked as a prosecutor in Swaziland initially and in Zimbabwe from 1981. She then went into private practice in February 1989 when she joined the firm of Cantor and Immerman. In 2006, she founded the legal firm of Mtetwa and Inyambirai, together with a long-term colleague, Tawanda in Inyambirai. Beatrice has sat on and continues to sit on the boards of various charitable organizations. She is the past president of the Law Society of Zimbabwe. Her work in protecting freedom of the press has seen her being appointed to the boards of the Zimbabwe Independent and Standard newspapers, the Mail, and the Guardian Group, media group as well as various other telecommunications and energy corporations. Beatrice is an avid human rights activist, a constitutional litigation lawyer, and she has won various international awards in recognition of her defense of the freedom of expression and freedom of the press. This includes the 2003 Liberty, Justice, and Law Society Human Rights Lawyer of the Year Award, the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom 2005 Award, the 2006 London-based Index on Censorship Press Award in the law category, the 2008 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the 2009 Sydney and Felicia Kentridge Award by the General Council of the Bar of South Africa. She is also a recipient of the International Human Rights Award 2010, the highly esteemed Inamori Ethics Award by the Case Western University 2011, and she was honored by the Law Society of Zimbabwe with the 2011 Defender of Human Rights and Rule of Law Award. She received the coveted Ludovic International Human Rights Prize, an achievement which, listen to this, she shares with the former South African President Nelson Mandela. They are the only Africans ever to receive this award. Most recently, Beatrice has been awarded an honorary degree of laws by the Francis Xavier University in Canada. She's also the current board chairperson of the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. Beatrice Mtetwa is a naturalized Zimbabwean lawyer, and the New York Times described her in 2008 as Zimbabwe's top human rights lawyer. I introduce to you a Zimbabwean lawyer. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very elaborate introduction. And thank you for the invitation. But more importantly, of all the Zimbabweans to whom Alex was a dear and dear scholar, thank you for conceiving and bringing memorial lecture honor. The Kent Law, something that we Zimbabweans have not done. And I thank you, Zimbabwe, in recognition for a humble man who was able to really a very into order that's ordinary. We miss that analysis, and we feel it particularly on looking at the current turmoil that the country is going through. And if yeah, I know that it would have been down legal that would have. So we miss you very, very, very much. And to get the topic at hand, you will me if I don't give, because practicing lawyers, we do not interventions on this particular various reasons, because we live a society one of the environment we live in. However, because I'm passionate about how to affect the lives of ordinary, it will be appropriate to try and follow in his steps in my comment by looking at the practical aspect of giving this back, and to do the question will be why the world should really to be part of it.
Sorry, Beatrice, the audio is particularly bad. So I'll suggest two things. Maybe if you get closer to the microphone and then maybe speak a bit slower. We've got 45 minutes for you, as long time as you want. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll try slowly, which I'm used to, and I've tried to get. So I was saying, most people will wonder why infected human and so what part and part of this act that you taking into account the that are always going. It might help to start at that level. So Zimbabwe has a constitution that was adopted. It is generally many.
Okay, so Beatrice, sorry about this. We have to try another method. Is it possible for you to turn off your video? Maybe we'll have enough bandwidth left for audio, and if that helps. If that helps, that would be fantastic. If it doesn't, we will have to ask you to record your speech and the paper for us. We hope it works. That's, yeah, it gets better now. Let's see if that works. If otherwise, we would have to just go to the roundtable section of the, yeah. Beatrice, let's wait for you. Now that it's off, let's go.
Okay, let's try that again. So I had started thinking about why the corporate world would be interested in this. And I was making to section 4 Constitution. A lot of here do denigrate, but I consider that some very useful things that would be a very pro human rights. society, Zimbabwe. Section 44 is relevant to this topic because it provides the obligation to corporate to also respect, promote, and fulfill rights. And this is done on the basis that all persons have that obligation to protect, promote, fulfill human rights. So it is very, very important that we remind corporates that they do have a legal constitutional obligation to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. The question then becomes how this can be done. This is particularly so in a country like Zimbabwe, where there are often complicated links between governments and corporates, and where the corporate and the government are sometimes so closely intertwined that it is different to separate one from the other. Obviously, I'm not going to name corporate, but I will use examples such as most of you will be familiar with, where, for instance, in Angola, they had Sonangol, which was a company very closely connected to the Dos Santos family when their president was President Dos Santos. So we have similar corporates in Zimbabwe who are exactly in the same position as Sonangol. And of course, Zimbabwe being Zimbabwe, on the other extreme, we have corporates who would be immediately shut down if, in fact, there was a whiff that they were in breach of the human rights obligations that they have under Section 44. Those of you familiar with Zimbabwe will be aware that regulatory legislation is sometimes used to shut down those perceived to be against the authorities. And you will be familiar that even the tax authorities will pounce on certain companies faster than you'll realize, as and when it is seen that certain corporates are doing what might be deemed to be anti-government. If I were in the corporate world, I would ask myself, what benefit would be there in respecting, promoting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights? And obviously, insofar as I'm concerned, benefits would accrue both sides if one is operating in an environment which respects human rights. Obviously, an environment which respects human rights will result in greater productivity because the corporate will be having hopefully a happier workforce, and that in a normal environment would result in an increase in profits, which basically is what corporates are out there to do. So corporates should, in fact, be part and parcel of the crusade for observance of human rights. for no other reason than that they would benefit from such observance. But then there are many hurdles towards the attainment of human rights, especially in the developing world. We have in Zimbabwe, for instance, unprecedented levels of poverty and unemployment. And sadly, this really applies to a lot of the developing world. So there is always the need to try and balance the employment creation, poverty reduction against the constitutional obligation to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights and freedoms that the people are entitled to enjoy in terms of our constitution. But how do we balance these competing needs? As the constitution also protects various other rights, such as the right to human dignity. But if corporates are stopped from operating because of human rights violations, of course, there'll be those who will be saying, what dignity can one really enjoy when they're unemployed, when they're hungry, when they're poverty-stricken? We also have provisions that speak to the freedom of profession, trade, and occupation, and labor rights. Again, those freedoms can only be enjoyed because one will be employed or one will be practicing their profession. So all of these rights are premised on one having a profession to practice in a working environment. And yet in countries like Zimbabwe, the unemployment levels are so high that there are those who would look at the balancing act as, being first and foremost to provide employment in the hope that this might help reduce poverty and unemployment. I don't know if one can balance those two in a manner that would give some form of equilibrium. I very much doubt that would be so. But I speak from a position of privilege because, I do not know what it is like.
It's okay, Tina.
Sorry.
You have power.
Can everyone please turn their microphones off, other than Beatrice?
Okay.
You just want me to do everything, Mama.
Shall I Madam Moderator, shall I proceed? Can I proceed?
Please. Yes, please proceed. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please proceed.
All right. Oh, okay. So I'll proceed. Corporate and commercial law is, of course, going through many developments which impact on the observance of human rights, particularly in the developing world, where we always lag behind in legislating for these developments. And when we do ultimately legislate on them, we are usually basically playing catch up because we do not have mechanisms of tracking these developments for purposes of ensuring that We update our legislation as and when there are these material changes. These fast developments are generally in new technologies such as artificial intelligence, e-commerce, and other e-systems such as the newly introduced e-courts in Zimbabwe, which has a lot of implications, of course, for the ordinary person in the street, and including issues of access to justice by those who are excluded through lack of appropriate gadgets, for instance. How can you have access to justice if you do not have an appropriate gadget to log onto the system? How can you have access to justice if you do not have the data? So at a practical level, will it ever be possible to get equilibrium in the balancing act, considering that the developing world is always playing this catch-up, and yet our decision makers find it necessary to want us to conduct our business, and serious business, because litigation is a very serious aspect of our justice delivery system. And when you exclude certain sectors from that litigation because you have introduced an e-court system which is not going to be accessible to everyone, they need to look at how to balance that to ensure that those who have no capacity to access justice through the new system are still catered for. This is why, again, we need to look at how that can be balanced. Can it be balanced through legislation? Can it be balanced through ensuring that there are rooms in our various courts where these gadgets will be available, where we'll have access to Wi-Fi for everybody who wants to litigate? Those are questions that those responsible for our justice system policies will have to look at in order to give the balance that the topic wants us to speak to. The balancing act, of course, will also depend on whether or not there is political will to achieve it. And do the corporates themselves want to achieve this balance? If there's no political will, both from the perspective of the political leadership and the corporate leadership, again, this balancing act is not going to be possible. As I said earlier on, in most of our countries in the developing world, the line between government and big corporates is sometimes so blurred that one struggles to make out the difference. So many political players have close relationships with big corporates. Some of them have their children's fees overseas paid by these corporates. Many others are sleeping partners in some of these corporates. And furthermore, even where there are no relationships between the political leadership and the corporate leadership, there are always the problems where corporates immediately seek political protection, where one would be raising issues of human rights or would be litigating in order to try and ensure that the provisions of that Section 44 are brought into life and into effect. And of course, we all know that those relationships, even where they didn't exist, they can materialize very, very quickly for a price. So we have corruption, serious corruption. And even if we seriously had political will and we had lawyers, and I must emphasize that we do not have many lawyers at all who seek to look at balancing human rights and holding corporates to account on issues of human rights. So even if there was all of that will right across the board, you would have to deal with the spectre of corruption, which in Zimbabwe is currently quite rampant. So for a price, all of that can be undone if the right interventions from some political, powerful person is right. Of course, on the flip side, we also have seen how regulatory institutions can be quickly weaponized to deal with corporates who are seen to be not towing the line. So in the absence of a very, very strong political will, it is debatable that we can ever, in fact, achieve a balance between development in the corporate sector and the observance of and protection of human rights in our developing countries. There are violations that are generally prevalent in the corporate sector, where the balance is needed even more. I think we're all aware that in the extractive industry sector generally, that is where the big offenders are. They are quick to extract without putting back anything or without ensuring that community livelihoods are not destroyed without compensation. We all know of communities who have lost their fishing livelihoods due to oil exploration, where all sea life becomes adversely affected and fishing livelihoods are lost. In Zimbabwe, we have the mining sector, which has been the biggest culprit, where communities lose their pastures, they lose their agricultural land because the mining companies are looking for whatever might be under that ground. And this is all generally done without compensation. Of course, on paper, there's provision for communities to have share schemes, etc. And where these do exist, we have seen that they are not transparently handled and that they are controlled by traditional leaders who basically use them as their own piggy banks for their own benefit, as opposed to using them for the communities that would have lost their livelihoods as a result of the particular mining entity not compensating. And sometimes even after the extraction, there is no attempt to rehabilitate the land, although there is legislation to deal with that. we find that the enforcement of the current legislation is so lax that, in fact, it can be called non-existent. And as most of the mining sector has been politicized, environmentalists always face an uphill battle when they litigate against these big mining companies, as there is almost always political interference in such processes. The need to balance the positive effects of increased investment and job creation has therefore never been greater than it is currently. And we do need fearless and robust judicial officers. We need strong, independent, professional lawyers who will be able to litigate on this without fear or favor. Sadly, it is difficult to say that we have any of these. I think, as most of you are aware, our judiciary's capacity to deliver justice to the people of Zimbabwe is at an all-time low, particularly in anything that might have a whiff of controversy or a whiff of politics. We struggle just to get justice on ordinary, everyday disputes. And if you were to take a big corporate, which has deep pockets, before a judiciary that is seen as being severely captured, the likelihood of succeeding in those circumstances is very, very slim. But I feel very, very strongly that the need to litigate is there and should be followed. Because for us to be able to say that the judiciary failed the people, we should have the empirical evidence that we took such and such a case and it failed. One of my colleagues, I think about 2 years ago, did take up a case where he sought to use Section 44 to say that the mining company involved was in breach of its duty under that Section 44. But when you read the judgment, it's quite interesting because you wouldn't even know that there was reference to that Section 44 and that there was a reference to the obligation on corporates to really observe, protect, and promote human rights, because it is an issue that is easy to sidestep by judicial officers. So there is absolute need to ensure that there is litigation, specifically pointing out the obligations of everybody, including juristic persons, to ensure that human rights are observed, and for lawyers not to be intimidated into not, taking these cases for fear of being ostracized, or also of not getting corporate work, because that's where the money is. Unfortunately, in Zimbabwe and probably in other developing countries, corporates are generally sacred cows that human rights defenders generally steer clear of. In a place like Zimbabwe, where just making a livelihood is extremely difficult, even for professionals, sometimes it is understandable, given the fact that corporates are the entities that would be able to give remunerative commercial work to lawyers. But I believe that even, where corporates are not being sued, or even just corporates should be able to fund human rights defenders. I always find it extremely annoying that human rights defenders have to depend on donor funding from outside the countries, when actually that obligation should be borne by the corporates, operate in the particular societies where the interventions will be required. I find it extremely contradictory that corporates are happy to splash on political parties openly, but will shy away from funding necessary human rights interventions. A lot of the corporates do have a corporate social responsibility departments, but generally, those CSR sections of the companies never ever consider themselves to be bound to also, have corporate social responsibility towards the defense of human rights. And we really should then look at what we can do in order to bring this awareness. So how can we do this? I have few suggestions, and people will be free to add their own. But we could inbuild in all investment agreements, for instance, clauses that would advance the observance of human rights by the investors. I do not see why the investment authority should not insist that all incoming investors should give really an undertaking that they will ensure that they comply with the provisions of Section 44. I also believe that the government legal advisors, such as the Attorney General, could also ensure that all agreements that they approve have clauses that would advance human rights by the corporate sector as and when those agreements are signed. I mean, we always hear about the cliche of universality of human rights. And in my respectful view, if there is universality of human rights, surely it ought to follow that there ought to be universality in the enforcement of human rights. So I feel very strongly that where there have been human rights violations, especially by corporates, the jurisdiction to intervene should be universal. And this is where bodies like the UN and other international organizations, the EU, and the African Union could come up. I know that, yes, they are looking at some of those things, but could come up with treaties and other interventions that would ensure that there is universality in the enforcement of human rights, in the protection of human rights, and that where a corporate from elsewhere comes to a developing country and commits violations of human rights and then goes back to their country, that universality would kick in where, human rights defenders in that parent country should be able to intervene. I also believe that corporates that will be bringing in new technologies should also be required to ensure that such technologies are human rights compliant. And where they are not, penalties can be imposed, or interventions by way of enforcement should be made possible using easy, user-friendly methods to do so. I also feel very strongly that access to justice on human rights issues should be made easier than other types of litigation by removing some of the extortionate court fees that we encounter in our litigation. Issues of court cost orders against human rights defenders who are seeking to enforce human rights legislation should be done away with. Legal costs in human rights litigation should only be considered where the court would have made an informed determination that the litigation was malicious, vexatious, or was informed by some other ulterior motives. But generally, where human rights litigation is embarked on, courts should simply not award cost orders against human rights defenders and the communities for whom they would be intervening. There are also issues of locus standi, which in Zimbabwe, particularly our constitutional court, is a big issue. In the normal course, the Constitutional Court on the Protection of Rights ought to be the most accessible court. You know, in some jurisdictions like India, you can write a letter to the Constitutional Court and the court will direct that your matter be heard as a constitutional case, and will even appoint lawyers to lead that litigation. In Zimbabwe, sadly, we find that issues of locus standi have been weaponized to deny litigants access to the courts. And this is being deliberately done by having the Chief Justice as a gatekeeper, for instance, where he scrutinizes and decides, not with a full Constitutional Court bench, but on his own, serious issues of whether or not a matter should be heard. And this gatekeeping does not even include giving the particular intending litigant the right to be heard on whatever will be deemed as maybe the right to bring the particular application or any other reason why someone thinks the case should not be brought. So I feel very, very strongly that issues of locus standi should be relaxed to allow anyone who feels that rights have been violated to bring that necessary litigation, including allowing international NGOs the right to litigate where violations have taken place in communities where the people are either unable to litigate because they simply do not have the capacity and means to do so, or are simply too scared to be the face of the litigation because there could be repercussions if you are seen to be challenged powerful corporates and powerful political figures. I also feel that one such intervention could be the introduction of specialized human rights courts where, persons with backgrounds in human rights would be appointed to preside over human rights cases. I have never really been able to understand why we think there must be courts specializing in commercial disputes, in labor law, family law, any other topic. But we do not consider that there should be a court specializing on human rights litigation. And yet this is a crucial sector in that really human rights are derived from the highest law in the land, being the country's constitution. So I feel that bringing in specialized human rights courts would help us achieve this balance that we are looking for, because we would have a court that would understand what we're talking about. More often than not, when we litigate on human rights issues, most of the judicial officers think, oh, there they go again, constitution this, constitution that, and they don't look at the gist of what will in fact be before the court. So that's one intervention that I think should be looked into. I also feel that the oversight constitutional institutions that we have in our constitution, the various commissions, the Human Rights Commission, the Gender Commission, the Anti-Corruption Commission, all of these are institutions that should be capacitated to litigate, to enforce rights in their particular oversight area. Because, it is presumed that they will know where the violations are. They will have some specialized knowledge of the particular area. And if these oversight institutions are capacitated to themselves bring litigation to enforce rights that they perceive would have been violated, that would also help in ensuring that we attain the balance that we are looking for. I've already said that I think corporates themselves should be reminded and encouraged over and over again to include human rights in their interventions, especially under their corporate social responsibilities, on the basis that they are obliged and enjoined by the Constitution to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. Of course, these are all pie-in-the-sky suggestions, given the many competing demands that the governments and other institutions will tell us are competing for government's funding. So I don't think we can seriously expect our governments to intervene and to police seriously the corporate sector when they are actually failing to enforce the basic existing human rights instruments that we have. I've already stated that we also have the spectra of corruption, which again is in Zimbabwe very endemic, and which militates against the interventions that we expected would come from the provisions in our constitution. So we all need to put our heads together to look at how this balancing act can be attained. And I think I will end here. And of course, had I known in advance that I would have to give this kind of a talk in a memorial lecture like this, if I had known this before Alex had left us, I would very definitely have asked him to leave me a draft so that you would all have an excellent lecture, because I do not believe that, I could give anything like Alex was able to give. And thank you very much again for your invitation for me to speak.
Thank you very much, Beatrice Mtetwa. That was a fantastic lecture. It was listened to with rapt attention. I nearly think it was better you were not here, because everyone listened to every word much more, with more intensity than if you had been here. Yeah, the lecture got better immediately. We put off all the mics and cameras, and we heard everything you've got to say. We thank you very much. If I request one more round of applause for her, would it be too much? Thanks so much for that. We have just a few minutes for the question and answer in relation to Beatrice's lecture before we move to the roundtable. Let's do that very quickly. Anyone online can also join. Just let us know. How you let us know? Type something. Raise your hand. Yeah, if you raise your hand, we'll call on you. But there's someone here already, a student of international business transaction, I think. Yeah, please go on.
Positive examples of kind of already for them. Are there any possible examples you can provide?
Yes, he's asking, do you have any positive examples of companies that are already doing some of the things you highlight here you would like to see? Are there any companies doing that in Zimbabwe or anywhere else you may know? Question from, what's the name? Timo, a student, one of our students here. Yeah.
This is why it's probably all pie in the sky, because practically we have very, very few interventions from companies, from even us as lawyers, because we are more a reactive sector than a proactive one. There are a lot of social responsibility programs, but generally they shy away from human rights issues. Where there are interventions, it's perhaps, the specialized NGOs that are specific to those particular sectors. Most of the corporates in Zimbabwe look at, drilling boreholes in certain communities, provided assistance with education, etc. But human rights, we shy away from that. In fact, in Zimbabwe, because human rights violators include the government, most corporates would shy away from openly supporting, any interventions of a human rights nature. So no, I cannot immediately think of practical examples of corporates who are doing that. But I also feel that we have not, as human rights defenders, gone out there to court corporates to show them the benefits of interventions, to say to them, if you are operating in a good human rights respecting environment, your returns might actually be better. I think we also are to blame for the failure to actively court corporates to understand that we are not out to discredit anyone. We just want what the Constitution says should be done to be done. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you very much. The students appears to be satisfied with that. We have a question from Dino Christosis. Dino, just a second and I'll find you and can you unmute yourself? Yeah, that should be weird.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you very much. And good evening to everyone, and congratulations to Kent Law School for this amazing tribute to former colleague of mine, Alex Magaisa, who taught for many years at the University of Nottingham. I don't think there's a greater honor that you could have done for him in convening the annual lecture, other than, of course, to pick who you did pick, an outstanding human rights defender from Zimbabwe. My question to Beatrice is that in your talk, you seemed to have a massive embrace of universal jurisdiction. I'm an international lawyer, and universal jurisdiction seems to be chosen for very select crimes such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, possibly piracy. Are there any limits to what you see for universal jurisdiction, or do you think it's something that should really be reinvigorated and applied to all sorts of things, including corruption, which was a major thematic of your talk?
Thank you, Dino, for that question. I believe that where, in particular, the perpetrator of a particular violation is able to escape by going elsewhere, jurisdictions should follow them wherever they are. As I said, if we say human rights are universal, when somebody violates those rights, surely the enforcement should also be universal. And if some company from wherever comes to Zimbabwe, digs up our minerals and leaves gaping holes where we can't even do what we used to do before, and they go back to wherever they come from, I do not see why we cannot have jurisdiction wherever that violator is. And yes, I do believe that when it comes to human rights issues, we should not limit universal jurisdiction to war crimes, terrorism, or this or that. We should have jurisdiction wherever the perpetrator is. And I feel very strongly about this because people get away with it because of these jurisdictional limitations. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Online, yes. This would be viewer. Lighthouse guest. You can ask a question if you have your hand up. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I think you responded to one of the questions that I wanted to ask. And that was, have you approached these corporates maybe privately and maybe solicit for funds to assist? I know that it would be difficult for them to publicly come out and say that we are funding lawyers who are defending human rights activists. That's the first thing. And the second thing is on having, like the previous speaker said, the international law, having lawyers from different countries come and maybe defend human rights activists. I'm not sure. Maybe I need more information on that, because I remember in 2018 during the elections, I remember the 2018 elections when we had lawyers from South Africa were not allowed to represent Advocate Nelson Chamisa. So maybe it's a different law. I'm not sure, like maybe this is human rights and then that was election. So I'm not very well versed. If you can just please explain if they would be allowed to practice in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. You know, in Zimbabwe, when you are a human rights defender, you find that even corporates don't want to be seen anywhere near you. Even just seeing someone you know very well who is a corporate and even being seen having lunch with them raises suspicion. So you'll find that if I even asked some corporates if I could come to their offices, they would rather I'm not seen anywhere near there. So yes, you know, we should be approaching corporates. If we approached them for funding, personally, as an individual, no, because I think ethically there would be problems with that. But I am aware that some of the NGOs have definitely sought, you know, support from local entities, and I'm not aware of them actually giving such support even privately, because in Zimbabwe it could cost you your business. You know, that could unleash a lot of problems for you as a corporate, because you know, human rights defenders are seen as enemies of the state. I'm looking at it from the perspective where I feel that corporates should themselves look at the environment and support human rights work without being asked, because, as I said, that Section 44 requires them and joins them to promote, protect, you know, fulfill human rights. And as I said, it should not be difficult to justify why you're doing it, because you should be able to say, well, Section 44 says juristic persons also do have an obligation to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill human rights. And but of course, the reality is that the bottom line is corporates are there to be in business, and they'll not do anything to jeopardize their businesses. And any CEO who would openly support human rights work would probably have the board fire them promptly. The second part of your question relates to lawyers from other jurisdictions coming into Zimbabwe. It used to be a formality, really, to get people to come and argue cases in Zimbabwe. I remember many years ago when I did the Justina Mkoko litigation, when she was abducted and then sought to be prosecuted. When I challenged that in the Constitutional Court, I did bring in Advocate Jeremy Gauntlet from South Africa, and he came and he argued the case without difficulty, because it really just used to be a formality. All you needed to do was to get them to be registered for that particular case, and it was just a formality. And then enter Patrick Chinamasa as Minister of Justice. he is the one who started this nonsense of stopping lawyers from other jurisdictions from coming to argue cases in Zimbabwe. And since he started that, we have difficulty in bringing in lawyers. We currently have a pending application where we're trying to bring in a lawyer to argue a case in Zimbabwe. And there's a lot of dilly-dallying. And with the appointment of the new Attorney General, we very much doubt that we will actually even succeed in doing so, because I think the screws will be tightened more and more. And yet, in my respectful view, it really would be very, very useful for colleagues from elsewhere who have the experience to come and do interventions, to come in and help us navigate the problems that we have in our justice delivery system. Firstly, from the perspective that they would be taken seriously. Some of us, when we go to court, nobody takes us seriously because it's like, oh, what's new? She's always making noise. But also, it just would mean that, our judicial officers would realize that they are on an international stage where they must perform. Otherwise, they'll be discredited. And also, it takes away the targeting because, human rights defenders are targeted in Zimbabwe. So if someone else comes from outside, it takes the heat off the few human rights defenders who are in Zimbabwe, because they will not be seen as the face of the litigation, because more often than not, it is perceived that it is the lawyers who get the litigants to bring the litigation, as opposed to the litigants saying, my rights have been violated, please represent me. So it's like we incite people to bring certain cases. But if we get someone from outside, we think that heat would be taken off us.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We just have time for one more, and that would be Donatella. Okay. Okay. Should I ask you to decide who? I'll go with the lady.
Yeah. My question is twofold. So, is it right, fair to conclude from Beatrice's discussion that the human rights legislation in Zimbabwe is weak or non-existent? And secondly, isn't there a human rights body put specifically to handle these issues that people are asking whether an individual can handle them on their own, or you're lobbying for corporate assistance, or lobbying for assistance from other countries? Isn't there a body put in place specifically to handle these human rights questions? For example, in Uganda, we have a very effective human rights commission put in place by the Constitution to handle all these human rights queries, in that when something is not being heard in the human rights scope, we run to the Human Rights Commission, which is put in place to handle these problems for us, so we do not have to hassle for this help.
So the first one is human rights weak and ineffective, and the second one is there really a body in? Can we conclude from your lecture that human rights is weak and ineffective in its effect in Zimbabwe? And is there really a body? Can we agree that there's a body? I'll take one last one so you can respond to both at the same time. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Mine around the issue of companies, the corporate sector supporting human rights. I think also sometimes in Zimbabwe, there's need for those who are fronting human rights to be principled. I want to give a specific example. Why? Because it was Dr. Alex Magaisa who helped me back then as an activist in Zimbabwe to identify non-state actors in human rights violations. And these are corporate companies like Imbalaka Rental Services, which is used to explain it maybe briefly.
Yeah. I think I've got the gist here. There's a gentleman here. You may want to identify himself. What's his name? Makumbera. Makumbera has been in the past advised by Magaisa, helped out in relation to a situation he faced with human rights with companies that abrogated is human rights. And the question is?
The question is, should a different approach like those granting human rights, like adopt a strategy to promote companies that support human rights? Would it work to motivate more corporate companies to support human rights? Because my issue, especially with Imbalaka rental services, was it's an epic example in that it has been outed, it has been proven in court numerous times, in the High Court, that it contributed to human rights abuses. But during the past elections, the European Union Commission Election Observer Mission came to Zimbabwe, and it hired 60 vehicles from this company, and it benefited, I think, in terms of profit, around 300,000. But this is a company which is the flagship of national detectors in human rights abuses. And this European Union Observer Mission, the bulk of its staff were Zimbabwean human rights organizations, staffers. But no one spoke out against that. It's promoting this company, which is a flagship of human rights abuses. So what do other corporate companies do? They will not be motivated to support human rights.
I don't know if you can hear that, but it sounds all very Nigerian as well. A lot of corporate conflict of interest, and how can we get accountability from these companies, since there's this dance, as you very rightly identified in your lecture. Thank you, between the corporates and the abusers. We listen to you now.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll start with the last question from Makumbura. Is it possible to support those corporates who observe human rights as opposed to supporting corporates like the one that he has mentioned? I agree that where there's clear evidence of a corporate violating human rights, really that corporate should be shunned and not supported. And the particular corporate he is referred to is known that, for instance, in its fleet, it really has cars that belong to the elite and the violators of human rights. So it was absolutely shocking for us that the EU actually went and hired motor vehicles from that very same company for its observer mission in Zimbabwe, when there are other car hire companies that don't have a stain on their, corporate actions that are seen as violating human rights. We were all surprised, and I was extremely surprised that also, as human rights defenders, we were a bit mute in dealing with that particular aspect, which I think was a really, really, big blunder. But then, Makumbura, you'll be aware that EU funds a whole lot of the NGOs. So if you are in an NGO that gets funding from the EU, you're not likely to be very vocal about what you consider, poor decisions in supporting a known human rights violating corporate. So there's a bit of self-preservation there, where we probably fear criticizing our benefactors because we don't have local benefactors. So that could very well be one of the reasons. And yes, I agree that where we have no evidence of corporates who have violated human rights, we should support them, but not support them in the sense that they've done anything good. I would prefer a situation where we have more positive interventions, where we support them because they have shown that they are supporting human rights openly without fear or favor and relying on the Constitution. Where we don't know what you have done, I don't know why I would want to support you. But where I know that you stood with the people and you have said, we will support interventions to stop these violations, absolutely, we should all be behind that corporate. And should we have boycotts of those seen to be violators? Absolutely, I think we should. I hope I've answered that question. And the earlier question, I think it was Donna or somebody, human rights legislation, is it weak or non-existent? You know, I think it's the enforcement that is weak or non-existent. Because if you look at some of our legislation, it generally is good on paper. If you look at the Constitution, for instance, and the provisions it has when it deals with human rights issues, it's like, wow, you know, Zimbabwe has good provisions in its Constitution. But do those provisions translate to real enjoyment of human rights? Absolutely not. Why? Firstly, we have a judiciary that does not want to hear about human rights, which is very, very sad. So we do not have a judiciary which will robustly engage on issues of human rights, because basically our judiciary is largely captured. We have maybe 4 or 5 judges who are still judges, but a whole lot of the others are captured and would never, ever want to be seen to be protecting human rights. Decisions are made based on no law at all, even where there are laws that specifically say what should happen. They've become masters in looking for technicalities in order to avoid hearing constitutional challenges on human rights issues. So the legislation, more often than not, it does, but do not have enforcement. This is not to suggest that we as human rights defenders are any better. I think we also have not been as robust as we should have been in pushing these human rights cases to the court. I know that I've said that we are not taken seriously, and it's precisely because there's so few of us doing the same thing that, you know, when they see you, they think, oh, she's trying to embarrass us, etc. But I think that as lawyers, we should not tire. Where you feel there are violations, you should challenge. So I think we don't have enough robust, independent lawyers who are willing to take certain cases to court, and we do not have fearless, independent judicial officers to enforce human rights.
Thank you very much, Beatrice.
The question about a body like a human rights commission, etc. Yes, we do have oversight commissions in Zimbabwe, but generally the president appoints people there, and there are very, very few human rights defenders who find themselves there. And the few who have, the minute they are there, they get extremely comfortable in the 4-wheel drives that they get to be commissioners, etc. So they become diluted immediately on appointment. I feel very strongly that the appointment process should be left with other human rights defenders who will know who would be able to discharge the obligations that were envisaged when these oversight institutions were included in our Constitution. I hope that does answer.
Thank you very much. I think it does answer the question. A final round of applause for our major speaker. we will now move, and we're enjoying everybody to remain right there. You will still be able to hear us. We will now move to the roundtable section, and just going to be 20 minutes. Speakers are now told we have 5 minutes each. I think there are 4 of us in the roundtable here. Donatella Alesdrasani is supposed to be the chair of this session. There's not much to do, just just take care of the. No, you're not going to speak. You're the chair of this session. Yeah, you may want. The speakers are Ohio Omino, sorry. Yeah, please. Dr. Ohio Omino, reader at the University of Kent. We have our good Professor Winston Mano from Westminster School, Media and Communication. We should have Tafi Inyanwanza. Please come. Do we have Yvonne here? Yvonne is not here among us. So yes, the roundtable section now begins. Donatella would set things in motion, and someone can help with the camera to view them. Yes.
You want to go and sit down, and I'll play with the cameras, and then I'll get the views if I can't do it. Used to me. Right. Okay.
Yeah, welcome, and it's lovely to be able to celebrate Alex. That was a fantastic lecture, and it embodied very much the spirit of Alex is thinking about company law and capitalism, the balance between corporate power, accountability, and politics beyond the law. So there was a wonderful way to celebrate and start the celebrations, Beatrice. Thank you so much. So I don't know if we're going to follow a particular order. I think who would like to start first with the reflections? Yeah?
Ohio took over his course. Let him start.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. So good evening, everyone. I think it's with mixed emotions that I actually sit here, and the reason is that I never had the opportunity to meet Alex. So when I was doing my research, so I've been at the law school for about a year now, just actually a year. So when I was doing my research about the university and the law school, one of the major attractions for me was the opportunity to work with Alex. And so unfortunately, before I arrived here, I got the job and came, was no longer with us. And so when I was having my meeting for the allocation of courses, so I was sort of going to teach company capitalism. Now at that point in time, I wasn't aware that it was a course that he had taught previously. So it was when I was going through his notes, or the notes that were left, in the archive for the next person to take over, that I came across, the references that made it clear to me that I was taking over. Well, obviously I was part of the teaching team, but in being part of the teaching team, I would say I've had the privilege to kind of interact with the subject which was clearly dear to Alex's heart. And testament to that is also found in that a lot of students have met. I've met people outside of the University of Kent. And when I say to them, oh, I teach at the University of Kent, the first or the next question is, did you know Alex? And then I've heard things like, oh, I was a student, or I've heard responses like, his commentary was very important. I've heard so many amazing things. And so for me, being able to go through his materials has been very important in being able to have a peek into the man he was. And listening to Beatrice speak about trying to find this balance between corporations and the activities of corporations and human rights in Zimbabwe, in many ways, it makes more sense to me now. A lot of the things I've seen in the notes and the topics and the framing of the subject company-owned capitalism. So by the way, we teach company-owned capitalism here at the University of Kent, and it's a subject that does a very amazing thing. It takes the students through the normal rudiments of understanding what a company is, but doing so within the context of understanding the political, economic ideologies that frames what companies are, how they are managed, and how they are critical to the functioning of the global economy, national economies, regional economies as well. And so while Beatrice was speaking, I want to kind of like respond in a way to her talk about base or frame it within the context of what we teach. And this is conversations I have with my students. In terms of whether or not a balance can be found between Beatrice mentioned that there's the lines between corporate and government is blurry, and that the aim is to try and find a balancing act. And I wrote down, is the balancing act an illusion, or is it possible? And I believe that there are reasons why it is difficult or challenging, but I would say not impossible. And a number of these questions are what we interrogate during the course when we have conversations with the students. So for instance, I was taught company law from a very black letter law doctrinal perspective, just understand the statute that frames it, understand what companies are, what they do, how they are run, and how they can be liquidated. That was all. But obviously, as I got advanced in research, I realized that it was impossible to understand the basis of a company and what companies do without understanding the framework within which they operate. And they operate within a capitalist frame. And capitalism in itself has a lot of the answers, or in many ways tells us some of the reasons why we are trying to balance human rights with the activities or the aspirations of companies. So for instance, why would companies want to champion human rights if profit making is at the heart of what they do? It's a question we need to ask ourselves. Do they work across purposes with each other? Will it be the cost of championing and encouraging human rights be too much that it brings down the profit margins? And if that is the case, this in many ways speaks to what capitalism encourages from the outset. So if we are going to try and change or answer or find solutions or to balance these things, we need to interrogate the framework within which companies operate. Also, Beatrice mentioned the relationship between the state and corporations. And I would say, I said the relationship between the state and corporations is premised on the promise of the capacity of the corporations or private investors to make infrastructure financing gaps, especially in developing countries. And as such, they prioritize enabling environments for these businesses to operate, and they deprioritize the needs and the rights of people. So it's no surprise that there is always this tension between trying to balance the rights of individuals in states like Zimbabwe. And as Benga mentioned, I'm from Nigeria. It's a similar issue across the continent. Also, even in the face, for instance, of climate crisis or emergency, we're seeing that conversations about climate mitigation and adaptation is being the emphasis is being on private capital and profiteering, taking preeminence all over again. So even in the face of a potential global disaster, private profit still wins. Okay, and finally, we see that in states like Zimbabwe and even across the African continent and the global south, that little is done to promote domestic revenue mobilization. We have structures in place that leave or enable systemic tax avoidance strategies because it is profitable for private capital, for companies to have the strategies to be able to siphon money out of the countries where they operate. So in summary, or in conclusion, we need to rethink the ideologies, the systems that frame how companies operate in developing countries and even across the world. Because a lot of the issues that Beatrice mentioned are even present in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we teach our students about directors' duties, and Section 172 has this beautiful framing of the duties of directors, which includes, respect towards the environment and communities where they operate. But in practice, this is just all talk and really no action. Why? Because the interests and the profiting of these companies takes priority. So, but if we can start to dismantle or rethink this system, we have a better chance of being able to achieve the balance that Beatrice so eloquently passed across to us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the question about whether, in fact, the wealth generation in the form of profit maximization and respect for life, whether human or environmental is a possibility, was very much also at the center of what Alex was exploring with company law and capitalism. So thank you very much. Move to Tafi now.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Now, Alex was a storyteller. I mean, that's one thing that comes to the fore if you speak to anybody. He was able to bring down very complex legal issues to the level of the village, really. That's what he excelled at. And so I want to start my presentation or my response with a story. A few weeks ago, someone who is very prominent in the Zimbabwean story or the Zimbabwean culture came out on social media in a clip that went viral. And this is someone who is very politically connected, and he said something along the lines of, I've never seen an activist who is mentioned in the Forbes list of the rich. And of course, he was being very derisive about it. And in that statement, there are a few issues that come up and which I've identified and which I want to use for my response in the tradition of responding to a lecture of this nature. So first of all, as the first speaker identified, this paradox of which exists of whether you can have the pursuit of human rights at the same time that you also have the pursuit of capital accumulation. Is that at all possible? And I think that's contained in that statement. And then, of course, there is something that I think came to the fore recently when Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary in this country, was speaking about what she called luxury beliefs. Is it a luxury to pursue human rights in the context of countries like Zimbabwe, for instance? Now, just listening to Beatrice in a lecture, I identify with most of the issues that she presented, but I wanted to just maybe touch on one or two, three things that maybe she didn't touch on. In the Zimbabwean context, the real issue, to my mind, is the monopoly of corporates. Now, we all know that the problem that Africa has, or the challenge that Africa has, is this desire to attract FDI. And in the Zimbabwean context, and particularly in the southern African region, there's this race to the bottom. So when corporates come in, they are looking for conditions which are less inhibitive or the least inhibitive. So they go to countries like Zimbabwe, particularly because there are no protections for the common man or for the small man. So that is a huge problem. The second issue, of course, is that the few corporates that exist tend to be monopolies by nature. So in an economy which is generally informal, you have these few giants, giants that have become monopolies. And then, of course, another issue is related to that, which is investment protection. So when the government goes out to attract FDI, they make these promises to these big organizations that they will protect them, they will create special economic zones which are less protective of workers and have less, tax burden. So these are the issues, but what are the solutions? And I think Beatrice touched on a number of them, but foremost, to my mind, is the education of our public. And I think we agree that Alex excelled at this. He was able to come out of the ivory tower, to go to the level of the village, and to educate them on these complex issues. So education, very critical. But secondly, and I think Beatrice did touch on this, the class action regime, very weak in my assessment. There is an act, the Class Action Act of 1999, but very recent, very weak. It hasn't really been stressed, and it needs for more activists, in the mode of Beatrice, to really make use of that. And of course, finally, access to justice. So those that are familiar with the Zimbabwean context will be aware that the current regime, the current president, is sitting on a bill. It's called the Private Voluntary Organization Bill, which might be enacted possibly in the next few weeks or so. He has been sitting on it for a while. But what he seeks to do is to really limit the civic space. And Beatrice touched on the ability of these organizations to assist, indigent litigants to mount up, class actions. But when that comes in, that will basically be the death of this access to justice too. So those, I feel, are the issues. And perhaps finally, shareholder activism, again, very weak across Africa generally. But I think as we go forward, and one thing that we could take from this lecture is that we need really to educate our population on shareholder activism, to hold corporates to account in terms of their duty, in light of particularly Section 44 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. Those will be my submissions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I last met Alex when he was with Stanley. We just watched Daniel at the Mayfair Hotel in London. And I had a very interesting encounter. Shami was reminding me about that. I told Alex that the reason why I was late to that premiere was that I was racially abused. And he said, he laughed so much. And he says, oh, people throwing things at you. That happens a lot, It can be tough. But he was, again, a very special man. And I want to remember him as a champion, as a fighter. But in contribution to today's debate, I would like to steer it towards consumer rights. This is something that Alex used to help us, especially those in the Zimbabwe community. I thought about him a lot, and I was reviewing some of the communication between ourselves, and there was a lot that went on, but I want to especially focus on an issue whereby, as a small consumer, as a person who is buying, for example, a car, sometimes you can be bullied and mistreated in ways that are very stressful, that can affect your everyday. And who do you turn to? People like Alex were very helpful in this regard. So I had a case where, for example, I part exchanged a car and the matter went on. The car that I bought was broken down, and the people would not give me the refund, would not give me the original car. And I said to Alex, what is this? And he said, well, there are some ways in which we can deal with this. So there were issues about the liability of those involved. They had got my money and put it in the account of another party. And so the supplier chain had been broken, The person that owed me was not necessarily the person that got the money. So it became very complex for me. I said, I gave this company money, of course they should give me the money. I used the Barclays card, I should get the money back. So Barclays was sucked in. I said, Alex, what is this nonsense? There's the big bank, there's me, there's these people, and for 1 year they've been refusing to give me back the card. So he was very interested in the case. He said, I'll use this as a teaching case. I'll come back to you and talk to you about some insights. But the long and short of it is that Alex really championed consumer rights, which are really important in relation to what we are talking about. And he would simplify, I think, what my brother Tafi was talking about. He would, I would call it in decolonial language, he lexicalize the law. Yeah? He would give language, a new language to law in ways that would make law accessible to people like me. So I would feel confident after talking to Alex to write a letter to Parklands, to write a letter to the ombudsman, to write a letter to these people with the sold me a car. And I took the matter to court. But in my arguments, for example, I relied very much on Consumer Credit Act, which I feel, although it's available in countries like Zimbabwe and African countries, it's not very strong. Statutory rights are weak in Africa, are weak in Zimbabwe. And this is, although we have oversight bodies, we still need enforcers. We need lawyers that can help to activate these laws. So I talked to Alex, and he says, "Look, you can challenge, the agent's relationship, whereby, for example, we need to lift the veil in the owners of this company." He also said that we need, for example, to go on the way they are interpreting law. So he challenged, he asked me, he advised me, or gave me wise counsel. He was my litigation friend. He said, for example, you can challenge them that their interpretation of law and the fact is based on an overly literal basis, which pays scant regard to the purpose of law. One would, of course, expect that the office of the collector, this was the ombudsman's office, should adopt a more purposive interpretation of the law and the facts leading to an approach that safeguards the interests of vulnerable consumers against machinations of this. So these were very profound kind of statements. And to put that in the letter, I think somebody from the ombudsman's office asked me, "Oh, so what do you do? What do you do?" I couldn't say I am a professor of law as well. But there are many examples, yeah. So I would say that I mean, he was very instrumental. For example, in breaking down the data creditor-supplier relationship, it was crucial in my winning of the case. So he then advised me to go to a small claims court. I took this letter and the judge asked the people to come with they sold me the car. Of course, I won the case and I phoned Alex happily. And he said, "Oh, yeah, congratulations, we should celebrate." But I think he was a champion of consumer rights, and this law school is really congratulations for setting this up. And I would feel that there is a lot that we can do here in the UK as the search for profits intensifies. We have companies that are shortchanging the public. Energy companies, big banks, a lot of corporates. I recently read a story, for example, in Nottinghamshire, a widow faces losing her house because her husband borrowed £16,000. But now the bank is wanting to sell the house, and the bank will pocket 75% of the property's appreciation if the house is sold. So I thought, when I read this story on BBC, I thought about Alex. I said, if this family knew of Alex, yeah, definitely they will get something, to challenge this situation. There are many situations like this. A lot of people are going through stress, and the law school, I noticed we have a clinic here. We do well to uphold Alex's legacy by going into consumer rights, by helping the ordinary person. Sometimes that conversation and the insights that you have can help another person to overcome a serious problem. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Alex was a wonderful person. He was a good colleague to have. One of my most striking moments with him was my first experience to listen to a lecture that he gave. He's just left now. My former supervisor with Mansell organized a lecture when the Cecile was still very new, and Alex spoke at it. I've never had someone speak so clear about issues. Clarity of thought just hit me. Okay, this is a wonderful friend to have. Yeah, and he was great in that. I will do something very African. I have to acknowledge some people. I've already acknowledged with Mansell is left. We have our legendary, I know he's already looking at John Whiteman, that I need to acknowledge is here. He was here. He gave all of us our first shot at life. I've seen online Didier Herman. Yeah, I've seen online also Aneldi. I've seen all of you. Thank you for being here. Those online are still there. 26. Wonderful. This is a good start. We intend to do this annually, and we hope it gets better every year. By next year, we will be doing it, bringing in the Zimbabwean societies, the African societies on campus. We need to do this for him because he deserves it, and because we need to remind ourselves of who we are as well. Everyone who is in the Kent Law School is a trusted hand in this area, critical, on the right side of history, I hope, and on the right side of the law. My 4 minutes remaining will be spent on a very big topic, and that's how companies relate to space. So we've been talking about corporations and companies. Now we have a very interesting situation, which I will forgive you if you've not heard much about, and that's that companies now have their eyes on outer space. They now have somehow been able to capture the the United States attention. They've got the United States on board. The United States in 2015 made an act which made it possible for companies to go into outer space, land on asteroids, land on any planet, including the moon, and mine resources there and bring it back to Earth to sell. So that's my own view of company and their possible dangers, challenges, and yeah, what's there to report? The US has done that. First, what companies do is to capture the higher ground. They do that by capturing what we call in Foucault called biopower. They capture the biopower of the states, the coercive powers of the states to make laws and to break open opportunities, particularly Western countries, particularly countries that have the economic clout. And then that makes it possible for them to do anything, which they have been doing over the centuries. It's not a new thing. Companies like the Dutch East Indian Company, companies like the United African Company, UAC, used to own countries. They literally owned regions. The entire West African region was owned by the UAC. Similar things were done in Asia. And the laws of the states of European countries, powerful states, allowed them to even sign treaties. To sign treaties with, the countries, and they allow them to make profits through slavery, whatever needs to be done. But they do it through the law, and this is why I think we have to we are in the right place to discuss that. They do it always by capturing the law. And what I'm telling you right now is that they've captured some countries, the United States, Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, UAE, and Japan have all made laws to say that it is illegal for companies to land on asteroids or any planet, capture any mineral resource they find there, which could be platinum, which could be whatever it is, vibranium, if you've watched the film Black Panther, and bring it back to Earth to sell. That is such a massive shift in the imagination of what can be done through the law and through companies. Yet there is a massive silence over the issue. And that's part of it, the fact that the right press are not discussing it, the The academics are not discussing it. Those academics that are discussing it are ridiculed and attacked in so many ways and excluded from board memberships. If you have, as I have, and I have no regrets about it, written against that development, the least that happens to you is abuse. I don't think, and I'm sure many of us here will agree with it, that it's perhaps not good for our environment, that companies can go into outer space and destroy outer space environment. Indeed, the first law that was made by the United States said that companies can do it, broke that ground, leveled it for them, and then said for 8 years, from 2015, for the next 8 years, companies can do anything in outer space without any fear of any environmental laws. What kind of law is that? They literally said you can go out and do anything you want. Don't be afraid of the environment, because they call it the Spurring Commercial Activities Act, Spurring Commercial Activities. So go destroy outer space, that's fine, for 8 years. That was one of the few good things that came out of the pandemic. They didn't have that much time, but they're back now. Now about 5 companies are doing very well, controlling the 1.6, right now it's 1.7 billion US dollars market. It's meant to increase at a 16% rate every year. And we have about 5 leading companies in that market. And I think this is all not just good news, precisely because, and I must say that very quickly before I stop, because the international law that we had before now stated categorically that outer space is not for appropriation by any country. Stated that. We have about 5 treaties on outer space and 5 agreements or soft law. And at least 3 of the most important, the 1967 Space Treaty, the Moon Agreement of 1978, say quite categorically that outer space is the province of all mankind. That's using the Outer Space Treaty 1967 phraseology. And if you go to the 1978 Moon Agreement, we are talking about the common heritage of mankind principle. They stated it there, no appropriation, it belongs to mankind. And when we say mankind, we're not talking about mankind today alone. That's something we always forget. How about mankind in 2085? Mankind in 2100? Am I using the right? It's not just about us. So who gave anybody the right to go and take anything from outer space, especially when international law already says it can't be done? That's companies for you. The last thing I would like to say on that is that we should also be careful of the economic effects of what they are planning to do. So let's take platinum, for instance. Platinum is of scarce, it's scarce. Most things are scarce if they are natural resources. Platinum is supposed to be produced at a rate of $985 per ounce. Now, one of these companies that's going out to space says by the time it lands, and it's already in advanced stages of doing that. They are already doing prototypes. They are going to space later on this year, towards December. They say they are going to reduce the price of platinum production when they start doing that to, instead of $985 per ounce, to $50 per ounce. That's fine for them. How about the countries that depend on platinum being scarce and being expensive as the only thing that they can survive on? Who gave anyone the right to bring in new economics from outer space? What makes gold important is because gold is scarce. Now, if gold is endless, what does that mean to us? These are the questions that I hope we can deal with in the future. Alex discussed some of this with me. I miss him a lot, and I'm sure some of you do miss him. And I'm sure nobody misses him more than his wife, Shamiso. Thanks very much.
I hope we continue this conversation. So thanks to Benga for planned and organized this event. I know there's been a lot of labor. So just to conclude, thank you all. What really stuck for me is what you've all said. Alex held power to account He was fierce, he's a champion, a fighter, able to make very complex topics accessible to everyone, and most importantly, he was able to connect to people where they were. So thank you, Alex, and see you next year.
Thank you everyone for coming. And we're just going to sign off now, stop the recording, and we'll finish now. And thanks again to Beatrice. We really appreciate your contribution, and very much enjoyed your lecture. As Benga said, we were listening with rapt attention, and we'll look forward to sharing that with others once we're able to do so.